So I know we're going to be testing on the special senses on Monday, but I don't have anything left to go over with it. So we're going to move ahead to the circulatory system. All right. So circulatory system consists of your heart, blood vessels, and your blood, also known as your cardiovascular system. If you break that word apart, it means your heart and your blood vessels. So every cell in your body has the same requirements that we have as a whole, right? So in order to stay living as a human being, we need food, we need water, we need oxygen, right? And then we need to excrete the wastes from our bodily mechanisms. And every cell in your body is the same exact way, okay? Every cell needs oxygen, needs food, and needs water. So, and they're supplied that by the blood. Okay, so every cell gets oxygen taken to the cell and gets carbon dioxide taken away from the cell. Okay, every cell gets sugar and nutrients brought to it, and then its metabolic waste taken away. And the blood in the circulatory system does all of that. Now, I'm going to start with the heart. It's really important to be able to understand It's really important to be able to understand the structure of the heart as well as what functions each part provides, because every part of the heart is imperative to the functionality of your body. If any part of your heart fails, okay, that's when you start having heart attacks, that's when you start having dysrhythmias, and it becomes problematic and can potentially threaten your life. Okay, so your heart, it's about the size of your fist, maybe a little bit smaller. Okay, it's not super huge, but it's the workhorse of your body. It never stops, never says, hang on, I'm gonna skip beating for just a minute and just take a rest, right? It is always going. So when we look at this heart, okay, there's actually 4 chambers. So you see this chamber right here, and then this chamber right here. Those are the 2 smaller chambers of the heart. Those are called the atria. All right, and then there's 2 larger chambers. So here's this one right here. Okay, that is called your right ventricle. And then this one right here is your left ventricle. So these are the larger chambers of the heart, your ventricles. Okay, the atria, or singular atrium, are the smaller chambers. Okay, so in between the chambers, they are separated by valves. Okay, so this is your tricuspid valve. Okay, right, so the blood flow comes in through the vein, because veins go back to the heart. So this is your vena cava, superior, inferior, right? Because superior is above and inferior is below. And that feeds into the atrium right here. So you can see the openings for both of those vessels into the atrium. And then it has to go through the tricuspid valve, right? And then the blood will flow into the right ventricle. Now, the right ventricle's job is to pump the blood to the lungs. Okay, pump the blood to the lungs. So it has to come up here through the pulmonary valve, also known as a semilunar valve, because of how the valve shuts, and it kind of looks like a half moon when it shuts. So it comes out here through the pulmonary artery, because pulmonary means lung, okay, or air. And it'll go to the lungs, and it'll come back by the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. And then from the left atrium, the blood flow is going to go through the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve. Generally, we tend to refer to it as the mitral valve more often. And then it goes into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle is really the hardest working part of the heart. It has to pump blood to the rest of your body, to your fingers, to your toes. It has to propel it out through the aortic valve, which is also a semilunar valve, okay? And this goes through here. You can see the aorta up here, Okay, these vessels that branch off go to the brain and the upper body, like arms. Okay, and then they'll actually drop down behind the heart and go to the rest of the body. All right, so those are the basic structures of the heart. The heart itself, when we're talking about the different layers of the organ, you have the endometrium, endocardium. It's endometrium in your uterus. Endocardium, excuse me. And that's all the cells that line the inside of these cavities. It's the innermost layer of cells. Then you have the myocardium. Myo means muscle, so it's literally your cardiac muscle. And all of this is your myocardium. Okay, your heart is literally one ginormous muscle because it has to constantly pump blood to the rest of your body. But the myocardium is the muscle of the heart. When you have, like, say, a myocardial infarction, that's where you have a lack of blood flow going to the muscle of the heart. Then you have the pericardium, which is actually the sac that the heart sits in, and it completely surrounds the heart. Okay, so when we look at this, right, so you have your endocardium, which is the inner layer. You have the myocardium, which is like the middle, the muscle of the heart. And then you have the pericardium. Peri means around, right? So that's the sac that the heart sits in. Okay. All right, and then everybody thinks that your heart sits directly in the center of your chest, but it doesn't. It sits just a little bit to the left of the center of your chest. All right. Yeah. Okay. So we already talked about the valves and the chambers, but what I neglected to point out was this structure right here, down through the center. Okay, looks like a pillar going through the heart. That is called the septum. That is what separates the left and the right sides of the heart. Okay. Notice how this is all on the left, but clearly when you look at it, it's on the right, and then this is the right. But when you look at it, it's the left. This is from the patient perspective. Okay, this is the anatomical left and right sides of the patient if they were facing you. Just so you're aware. Okay. So this kind of does a really great visual of how the blood flows through your body. Your circulatory system is a closed circuit. It's only attached to itself, and it supplies nutrients to the body cells. And you don't have blood that leaks out into the rest of your body. It's contained in all of the blood vessels. Right? So remember how we talked about the vena cava? Right? This is the vena cava. It goes into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, up through the pulmonary semilunar valve. And this goes into the pulmonary artery, which then goes to the lungs, right? And that's where it takes all the carbon dioxide out of the body and it brings in oxygen. So now we have oxygenated blood. It goes through the pulmonary vein. Okay, and the pulmonary vein feeds into the left atrium through the mitral valve. Then it goes into the left ventricle, up through the aortic, semilunar valve, aortic, through the aorta. Okay, the aorta is the largest artery in your body, just so you're aware. Okay, and then that's going to feed to the arteries, which is going to feed to the arterioles, which are smaller arteries, which then go to capillaries, and then they go to the individual body cells. Okay, and that's where the capillaries they literally interlace with all your body cells so that it can just diffuse all the oxygen, carbon dioxide, the nutrients, and the waste products across that membrane to the capillaries, and then sends all the waste products back into the capillaries to the venules, which are small veins, to the veins, which then go to the superior and inferior vena cava, which are the largest veins in your body, and back through over and over and over again. It has this system. It's really important that you understand all the different parts of the system. That's going to be one huge question on your test, is to be able to, if you had a drop of blood, could you trace it through each and every structure that it would go through in the circulatory system? Okay. So, your heart is constantly beating, but it has different parts to an actual rhythm, right? Because the whole heart can't just squeeze all at once, because it would just purge all the blood out of it and it wouldn't be able to go through all the chambers. And it would take too long to refill to then push it back out to the rest of the body. So it has to go in a specific rhythm. But there is, when we look at the ventricles, which are the main chambers of your heart that supply blood to the rest of your body, right, because it has to propel it out from the heart. So when the ventricles are at rest, we call that diastole. It kind of looks like diastole. And then it's going to be followed by contraction, which is called systole. Okay, so this is specifically what we look at when we measure blood pressure. Like if you've ever heard of a blood pressure of 120/80, that 120, the top number, is called the systolic pressure, or the pressure of the blood being propelled out of the heart during systole when the ventricles are contracting. And then that bottom number, 80, is called the diastolic pressure. And that's the pressure of the blood flowing through your body when the ventricles are relaxing to refill with blood. Okay. All right. That's all I got for cardiac cycle. Conductive pathways. So you actually have an electrical system to your heart. So we have the mechanical, right? This is a mechanical where you have movement that propels the blood. That is mechanical. Now, we have electrical because your heart has its own electrical system. Okay, this is what we try to stimulate when we use an AED during cardiac arrest. So, you have different parts of the conductive pathways. Right? We have the SA node, which is the sinoatrial node. Okay, this is what controls a sinus rhythm, which is a normal rhythm. Okay, and it's located. The A means it's located in the atria. Okay, so this is what is known as the pacemaker of the heart, meaning that it propagates the stimulus to cause the heart to contract every single time. Now, you have pathways to both of the atria, because the atria are going to try to contract together. Okay, so it's got branches that go off over to this atrium, and then it also sends all of these branches down to what's called the atrioventricular node, the AV node. And it gets its name atrioventricular because it is in between the atrium and the ventricle. Okay, so you have this little hub of conductive cells, okay, and that's going to send the impulse through what is called the bundle of His, okay, and that's going to go into the septum, which separates the left and right sides of the heart, and then it's going to branch off into the left and right bundle branches, and that's going to come down to the apex of the heart, which is the point down here. It's going to come down to the apex, and then it's going to send all these individual fibers out called Purkinje fibers, and that is what stimulates each and every individual cardiac cell to contract, right? So the atria tend to contract together, and then the ventricles will then contract together. Okay, and this has to work perfectly every single time, right, in order for your for your body to sustain its own heart rate, heart beating. Okay. Now you have what are called arrhythmias, which are abnormal heart rhythms. Okay. So there's different ones. There's tons of them. Okay. And this is if any part of the heart is not contracting when it's supposed to, or if it's getting an electrical stimulus that may be partially blocked, like in a bundle branch blockage, or if that sinoatrial node, that SA node, is not firing exactly when it's supposed to, you can have what are called arrhythmias. And when we have life-threatening arrhythmias, that's when we use our defibrillator. Okay, we've learned in CPR that we really only at this level are going to use a defibrillator when their heart is not beating, or if it's beating in what's called atrial fibrillation. Okay. Which AFib, they're still going to be breathing, they're still going to be looking at you, right? This is why in first aid, when we talked about stroke, heart attack, if you have any sort of potentially life-threatening conditions that are going on, they could be caused by an arrhythmia. And we will use the AED just in case, because they could be an AFib, which is atrial fibrillation, where the top two chambers of the heart aren't actually contracting appropriately. And it can cause a lot of problems and ultimately lead to cardiac arrest. So there are times when the patient isn't going to be actually dead, right, where their heart is just completely fibrillating, like VFib, where we can use a defibrillator. Okay. So I talked a little bit about blood vessels when I was tracing the blood flow through the body. Now, there are three main blood vessels that you need to know about: arteries, capillaries, and veins. Okay, arteries carry blood away from the heart. There's only one artery in the body that does not have oxygenated blood, and that is the artery that takes the blood to the lungs from the right ventricle. Okay, but arteries always go away from the heart. Veins always go to the heart. Okay, the only vein that is oxygenated is the vessel that brings blood from the lungs to the heart, okay, the pulmonary vein. Then you have capillaries. Capillaries are very, very small blood vessels that take all of the nutrients in the blood to the individual body cells. Okay, so if you trace the blood flow, it goes from arteries to capillaries to veins to the heart, right? And so on and so on and so on. Now, I mentioned a couple of blood vessels that are not listed here. There's arterioles and venules. So if you remember back to talking about the respiratory tract, we have bronchi and then we have bronchioles, right? Bronchioles are what are affected during asthma attacks, right? And bronchioles literally mean smaller bronchi, right? So arterioles are just smaller arteries. Venules are just smaller veins. So you'll see blood will flow from arteries to arterioles to capillaries to the body cells, then back into the capillaries, then the venules, then the veins, right? So on and so forth. Okay. So I'm going to stop here with this video, and we're going to pick up with the blood composition and the different blood cells on the next video.